welcome to the Bible for Worship at St. Paul Lutheran Church on this 11th Sunday after Pentecost, when our gospel reading is written in Luke's Gospel, chapter 13, verses 10 through 17. Now, Jesus was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath, and just then there appeared a woman with a spirit that had crippled her for 18 years. She was bent over and was quite unable to stand up straight. When Jesus saw her, he called her over and said, "Woman, you are set free from your ailment." When he laid his hands on her, immediately she stood up straight and began praising God. In response, the leader of the synagogue, indignant because Jesus had cured on the Sabbath, kept saying to the crowd, "There are 6 days on which work ought to be done. Come on those days and be cured, and not on the Sabbath day." Responding to him, the Lord said, "You hypocrites! Does not each of you on the Sabbath untie your ox or your donkey from the manger and lead it to water? And ought not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan bound for 18 long years, be set free from this bondage on the Sabbath day?" When he said this, all his opponents were put to shame, and the entire crowd was rejoicing at all the wonderful things being done by him. The Gospel of the Lord. Thanks be to God. This is a powerful, dramatic story, isn't it? And as we'll see, it may show us as much about ourselves as it shows us about Jesus or about God. There's a lot going on in this story. What becomes our focus within it? Is it a healing story? It's fairly standard in that regard, although the woman never asks for healing, and that's usually part of a healing story. Is it a controversy story? Well, it also looks fairly standard in that regard. It's a leader of the synagogue. This is something of a debate about the Sabbath and what one does on it. Both Jesus and the leader of the synagogue cite either Torah or precedent in their argumentation. Both are pretty harsh, actually. The leader of the synagogue saying to the crowd, "Of course you want to be healed, but not today. Come back another time." And Jesus saying to the crowd, "You hypocrites." Interesting, isn't it, that for a controversy story, the leader of the synagogue and Jesus never actually address each other. They both address the crowd. Is it then perhaps a teaching story? Luke would help us to see this possibility in that at the very beginning, he says Jesus was teaching in one of the synagogues. And immediately after the story, Jesus goes on to talk about what the kingdom of God might be like in brief one-line parables that teach. And following that, Luke says Jesus went on his way, teaching on his way to Jerusalem. And yet, if that's the case, what exactly is the teaching? Healing story, controversy story, teaching story? Where does our focus fall when we hear this story? And does our choice of a focus, unconscious as it is, does our reading of this story as one or another of these perhaps show our interest or our concern more so than what may be in the gospel itself? If I see a healing story, does it say that I am looking for reassurance about compassion? Or I take note that it's a woman with whom Jesus is interacting, a theme that Luke particularly seems to stress more so than the other gospel writers. Is it that I'm looking for evidence of that power that God has to heal when healing is needed? Or if I see this as a controversy story in which Jesus gets the best of his opponents, am I perhaps displaying the fact that I want to know that I'm on the right side? I want more certainty in the answers that I can give. I want pretty clear lines laid out for what's right and what's wrong and who's right and who's wrong. That, after all, is what a controversy usually settles. Or if I see it as a teaching story, is it that I am looking for guidance, that I need wisdom to sort out how I should make my way in the world, that I'm looking for some insight into knotty questions that I'm having difficulty solving? Each of these three possibilities may suggest what it is that I'm looking for more so than anything else. And yet, let's go back to that strongest point in the story, one might suggest, when Jesus, in response to what's going on around him, says to no one in particular, "You hypocrites." Hypocrite, it's a Greek word, and in its construction, in its etymology, it literally means to have too little judgment. And Jesus doesn't say this to the leader of the synagogue. He sort of says it to the crowd, though that's not explicit. But he says there's too little judgment here. You're taking too little notice of what's going on. You've taken too narrow a focus on what it is that's right before your eyes. And so it suggests that for us reading this story, maybe that cry of hypocrites lands as squarely on us as on any of the characters if we tend to narrow the meaning of this story to only healing or only controversy or only teaching. It's not only any one of those. This is a rich, full story that includes a healing with God's power. And it's a healing of a woman who has been 18 years in her suffering. And with a word, Jesus heals her. It is a model of clarification. Jesus talks about the way in which, if you have concern for the well-being of your animals on Sabbath, and that's perfectly in order within his contemporary Jewish world and generally within the Jewish world, the preservation, protection of life always takes precedence over Sabbath. And so if you're willing to extend that concern to your ox or your donkey, then doesn't it only make sense that you would extend a similar concern to a human being? It's a model of that kind of clarification. And it's also a teaching of God's timeless care and power for those whom God calls into being in the world. Everyone whom God calls into being in the world. It doesn't matter whether it's Sabbath or not Sabbath. When it comes to God's care and God's power, that is always available to us. This powerful, dramatic story, even as it perhaps laid bare a bit of our own spiritual need or preference or inclination, also comes back to give us a full-throated affirmation of who God is, who Jesus has shown God to be, and how much we can count on God's care and power at every time. God bless.